attendees. I don't know how many the webinar can host at most, maybe 300, 500. I don't know the number, but we already have 240.
So the event will be last for 2 hours?
Yes. The event will be last for 2 hours, and it is recorded, and we'll upload the video to YouTube, and people can watch there. Let's just start. Now it's in East time. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this virtual event. My name is Zhang. I am assistant professor at the School of International Service in American University and a co-founder of this Theory History Society, which is a scholarly collective and a platform for research and dialogue in historical social science and social theory. Today, I will moderate this event with Tianfu Wang, professor of sociology at Tsinghua University. We are honored to invite Professor Xueguang Zhou from Stanford University to present his new book, The Logic of Governance in China, an Organizational Approach. Professor Zhou is co-Ting professor in economic development and professor of sociology at Stanford University. As many of you know, he works on organizations, institutions, stratification, and the state are very influential in both English-speaking and Chinese academia. Today, we are also very excited to have 4 excellent discussants. They are Professor Mary Gallagher, Amy and Alan Lowenstein Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan, Professor Zhang, Associate Professor of History at Ohio State University, Professor Yingyao Wang, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the University of Virginia, and Professor Fei Yan, Associate Professor of Sociology at Tsinghua University. After Professor Zhou's talk, they will give comments from different perspectives. Today's talk is the 3rd event of our book talk series, This Book Boom Room. And I also thank our co-founder, Professor Xiaohong Xu from University of Michigan, for his logistical support. This event is co-sponsored by the Department of Sociology at Tsinghua University. Now, I would like to invite Professor Tianfu Wang to deliver an opening remark. Tianfu, please.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Zhang Yang. Hi, everyone. So I'm very happy to see you online today. So we are very happy to have Professor Xueguang to present his new book. Xueguang has been a very good friend to Tsinghua University in past several years, until 2020. So we meet Xueguang every year, and we know. So actually, Professor Xueguang had taught at our department, and his lecture had been very much welcomed at Tsinghua and across China. At other universities. We know Xueguang have been working very hard in several fields. For me, she started digging the field of property rights, and then shifted to the governance of the Chinese government at various levels. I personally am not very familiar with his work, especially his recent work. Of course, when I was doing my PhD work at Chicago, I was very familiar with Professor Xueguang's work in stratification. But recent years, I lost and did not follow his research. Today, it's very a good opportunity for us to listen to Xueguang to introduce his new book, and I'm sure. So after so many years, his work in the field of governance, I'm sure he had very fruitful results. I am hoping in near future we could have the chance to invite Xueguang to come to Tsinghua again and give us talks and lectures, and even can give us lectures on his new book. So I wish this event very successful, and hoping and looking forward to hearing some other professors' remarks. back to you, Zhang.
Okay, thank you, Tianfu.
Yeah.
So now, please join me in welcoming Professor Zhou to present his book. Professor Zhou, you'll have 30 minutes for the presentation. Okay, please share the screen.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Tianfu, and thank you, Zhang. So let me first share my PPT. I hope you can see this. Can you see?
Yes.
My PPT, all right? Okay, great. So I want to thank the organizers and the panelists for your participation, taking your time to participate in this event. I very much look forward to your comments and the dialogue in the discussion session. And I also want to thank all of you who are in the audience for being here. In my introduction today, I want to talk about two items. So let me start here. And the first one is the motivation and the context of the research project that led to this book. And the second, I want to have a brief sketch of the key issues and the framework that organized this book. Okay, so let me begin with the first item, the motivation and the context of this research. As we all know, the reform and the opening up era of the last 40 years in China has really witnessed the most rapid economic growth in the Chinese history. It also provided really tremendous opportunities for those scholars to study China, especially in the form of close observations and ethnographic research, as many of us have done research in the last 4 decades. As we get close to the Chinese society, to what is going on in the Chinese context, and scholars, many of us found there's a set of really interesting paradoxical phenomena and issues. So for example, on the one hand, in the context of rapid economic development and social change, and we witness the leading role of the state and local governments with tremendous mobilizational capacities. And that partly accounted for the rapid economic success in China. On the other hand, we also witnessed really political cycles shifting between centralization and decentralization. And we witnessed frequent political twists and turns over the years. And at a lower level, we also observed flexible implementation, collusion, and loose coupling between policymaking and policy implementation, as many studies attest to these phenomena. And if we look at this relationship between the state and the bureaucracy at the lower level, there's also the cycles of shifting between what I called the tight coupling between policymaking and implementation, but also many times loose coupling. The local government could be very responsive, but also resistant to top-down policies in implementation. And there is coexistence of what we call the acceleration of downward pressures, 层层加码, and at the same time, collusions among local governments, 变通 and 共谋. And we also observed the coexistence of high mobilizational capacities in the Chinese bureaucracy, but also considerable inertia. And these phenomena are really widespread in different areas and localities. Many studies showed similar phenomena in family planning, in environmental regulations, in urbanization processes, and more recently, in the poverty alleviation campaigns. So these phenomena are interrelated and widespread. Now, these phenomena, the observations, really me interested in what I would call the institutional logic of governance, by which I mean those recurrent, predictable, and often causal relationships based on stable institutional arrangement. So this book and this project, I try to provide a unified framework to probe, to understand the underlying mechanisms across disparate cases and areas and over time. And part of the contribution of this book, I hope, is provide a set of analytical concepts and middle-range theoretical models that help explain or make sense of these observed phenomena. So let me just say a few words about the context of my research project that led to this book. I started my fieldwork in 2005, and I never expected they last this long, but they lasted more than a decade. I went to this agricultural town in northern China several times each year. Each time I'll stay a few days up to a few weeks. And in the first few years, I actually spent several months in this township. And during this period of time, I started publishing my observations, my findings in academic journal, in the form of academic articles in academic journals, mostly in Chinese and published in China. And by the end of 2013, collected these articles and submitted a book manuscript to the press. And it took 3 long years before it was finally published in 2017. So the book manuscript actually was completed by end of 2013. And thanks to the pandemic, when also all of us experienced this, our research was unexpectedly disrupted because of the pandemic. And in the shelter in place and staying at home, I realized that there's nothing better to do than rewrite my book, which was published in Chinese, rewrote it into English. And so it was I worked on this book manuscript for the last 2 years, and finally it was published last year at Cambridge University Press. So that's the larger context of this book project. And the organizing theme for this book really is the recognition, what I call the fundamental tension between the centralization of authority on the one hand and the effective local governance on the other. And this fundamental tension exists over time, historically, but also across many areas in Chinese society, in the areas of governance. So the logic of argument in this book really is to first recognize the fundamental tension, then ask the question, how did the Chinese state over time respond to this tension? And I argue that over time, there rose a set of institutional responses in the form of stable institutions and stable practice that try to respond to this tension, try to alleviate the pressures from this fundamental tension. But by doing so, it induces some unintended consequences that will affect China's political economic transformation in the future, as we witnessed in the last 4 decades, and now also into the future. And this table was presented in chapter 1 of this book. It really provided the conceptual framework for the theme that organized this book. So I started with the fundamental tension that is based on centralization of authority on the basis of hierarchies and ideology on the one hand, and the capacity of local problem solving on the other. And that triggered institutional responses. Here I listed four these different mechanisms, which elaborate in using case studies in the book. And also I discussed the anticipated consequences because of this, the rise of institutional responses. So I want to now unpack this table and the conceptual framework and provide some elaboration of the concepts, issues, and arguments in this book. So I'm now shifting to the second part that discuss the kind of issues and theoretical models that organize this book. So let's start with issue. The first issue is about the fundamental tension. As we all know, there's a tendency in the Chinese political system, both in history and today, the tendency towards the centralization of authority. It is often in the form of policymaking, the decision rights of policymaking centralized at the top and through a top-down process. The typical way we think about this, the way we talk about this is 号令自中央出 and 顶层设计. And there's a persistent effort to centralize control over resources and personnel management. And of course, we witness the ultimate and arbitrary power of the state historically and today. But on the other hand, we also know there's a very diverse cultural, economic, and social environments across different regions and different localities. And for example, there's a huge divide between rural and urban, between the coastal areas and the inland areas, between the state-owned and private-owned arenas. So effective local governance really requires a different way of approaching these issues. The capacity and effectiveness of local problem solving, how to deliver, for example, public goods provision, resolving local conflicts, and extracting resources. So these two modes, the resolving local problems and centralization towards center, really creates the fundamental tension, which I wrote in this book. The high degree of centralization of authority is at the expense of the effectiveness of governance at local level. Conversely, the more decentralized the governance structure, the more effective local governance is, the more likely that it will or is perceived as to undermine and weaken the authoritarian state. So this is where the the fundamental tension lies. As we all know, as well established already in the literature, the Chinese state is established built on 2 pillars: organization and ideology. Sherman's book published in 1960s already discussed these two themes. But on the other hand, both organization and ideology ran into crisis in the last 4 decades and even longer. So first of all, we can think about the limit of bureaucracy. As many studies have shown, the boundary rationality and diverse bureaucratic interests get into way of policy implementation. The principal agent problems, as discussed widely in the social science literature, are amplified by the size and scale of the gigantic bureaucracy in China. And as we know, implementation processes often involve multiple layers and multiple agents with diverse interests. So there's a serious limit to the bureaucratic management and governance. And also we also see the crisis associated with ideologies and beliefs. The society over the years become much more diverse in beliefs, in interests, and the traditional culture, Confucian culture, and the official ideology all went into crisis from time to time, as we witnessed in social media and so on and so forth. So all these crises related to organizations and the ideology also put more pressures on the fundamental tension. And this is where we have to think about how the state or the institutions respond with their different response mechanisms and what are the consequences of these mechanisms. So let me now shift to the 4 response mechanisms identified in this book and discussed in this book. The first response mechanism is what I called the uniformity in policy making and flexibility in implementation. So we all know that uniformity in policy making and in symbolic centralization has been key trademark in the Chinese political system. So major decisions are made from the top and carried out through so-called 顶层设计. But this institutional arrangement also allows and encourages or gave acquiescence to flexibility in local implementation. So we observed a wide range of phenomena. Sometimes the policy was made in a very general term, which allows local governments to add details to this whatever policy advocacy. Sometimes policies are specific, but it allows deviations in implementation. And also many times we see specially tailored policy, such as special economic zone, and also resources are allocated to the lower levels for policy implementation. And also, as Zhou Li advocated, the administrative subcontract system also provides this kind of what I will call the flexibility in policy implementation. Now, because of these institutional arrangements, what we find is what I call a variable coupling across levels of bureaucracy. That is, the allocation of control rights at different levels of bureaucracy creates many flexibilities in the system. If we think about Chinese bureaucracy along 3 levels, the principal, the supervisor, and the agent, correspondingly, we think about the central government and intermediate governments and the local governments, and we can conceptualize a theory of control rights. And this is one of, I think, the contribution of this book. It developed several mid-range theoretical ideas and models, and this is one of that. So we think about how the control rights are allocated in the Chinese bureaucracy. And in this book, I conceptualize 3 dimensions of control rights. One is goal setting. The second one is inspection. The third one is provision, the control rights over provision of incentive and the policy implementation. Now, by allocating these 2-3 dimensions of control rights across different levels, sometimes at principal level, sometimes at supervisor level, or some other levels, we can see a wide variety of mode of governance. So, for example, along these 3 different combinations of these control rights at different levels, principal or supervisor level, we could observe very different mode of governance. Sometimes could be tightly coupled, sometimes a subcontract form of governance, sometimes it's loosely coupled. And at times it could even become federalism, characteristic of federalism. I'm not going to get into the details of these discussions, but I want to highlight that from these specific issues we discussed and the middle-range theoretical models we propose in this book, we can really see that the Chinese bureaucracy is not static one mode, either centralized or or decentralized. Rather, it really evolves over time depending on how these different type of control rights are allocated across different levels. I will now shift to the second response mechanisms, that is the interdependence between formal and informal institutions. Of course, we all know formal institutions have been there all the time to ensure top-down control and stability. We talk about control over resources and control over allocation of personnel. But there's also the importance of the role of informal institutions in governance practice to allow flexibility. And here, researchers have already discovered a wide range of practice. The coexistence between formal authority and substantive authority in the hands of local governments. There are symbolic compliance versus collusion and a selective implementation, and loose coupling at the lower levels, and loose coupling between policy making and policy implementation to alleviate the fundamental tension. All these issues have been discussed, recognized, and really carefully understood in the literature. What I have been doing here is try to integrate this insight into the largest picture about how China has been governed into the larger conceptual framework. The third response mechanism is what I call the ritualization of official ideology. As we all know, in the long Chinese tradition, governance by morality or 道德治国 has been one of the key characteristics in China's governance. And since 1949, the Communist Party continued this practice in terms of political education and propaganda efforts from 1949 and even present today. But over the years, we also witnessed the erosion of the official ideology. Partly that's due to the Cultural Revolution with the most effort to replace Confucian culture with the Marxist ideology, and partly in more recent years with the rise of a pluralistic society. So what happened is that over the years, we find that political rhetoric becomes more a ritual and symbolic compliance. And so it turns all these political propaganda, political rhetoric from political weapon of control to political rituals. These rituals are still important because they signal the acceptance of the central authority and they provide the basis to exercise top-down power. But it really introduced flexibility between symbolic compliance and actual behaviors. So this is the third response. Now, if we think about these response mechanisms we have already discussed, they really produce the variable coupling. There is sometimes loose coupling, sometimes tight coupling between policymaking and implementation. So for example, the shifts among different modes of governance in the bureaucracy can shift into different either tight coupling, subcontracting, or loose coupling. And the informal institutions and practice introduce flexibility in policy implementation through 变通 and 共谋. And the ritualization of official ideology and symbolic compliance also allows the decoupling between what they say and what they do. So all these contribute to the variable coupling that alleviates the tension between centralization on the one hand and local flexibility in policy implementation. But the problem is that there's no stable equilibrium between the two sides of the fundamental tension. So what is the boundary of flexibility, for example? You either over-centralize, you have the loss of a local initiative, or you decentralize and you subject to the risk of so-called the loss of control. And there's economic literature discuss these kind of shifts. And there are many times we witness organizational failures in incentive design. And so that allows shifts across different modes of governance almost become a major issue to deal with. So the central authority in this larger context tried very hard to retain the ultimate power of intervention, the ability to disrupt local government actions and to redefine the boundaries of flexibility. And how do they do that? They do that through campaign-style mobilization. And that's the fourth response mechanism I want to discuss now. Campaign-style mobilization serves an important political weapon for dealing with pursuing policy targets or rectification of bureaucratic problems, at least from the eyes of the state. So folks, we witnessed this kind of major shift due to political campaign-style mobilization in the Chinese political history. So for example, in 1980, the so-called 思想解放运动 really put a shift from a tight coupling in a Mao era to loose coupling or decentralization in a post-Mao era. And in the last decade, the anti-corruption campaign really is another effort to shift from loose coupling to tight coupling or re-centralization. So campaign-style mobilization played a very important role in shifts across different modes of governance, as we discussed in the control rights theories. Now, another dimension discussed in this book is about state-society relationships. Because of time limit, I'm not going to get into this. But let me just move on to talk about the third set of issues, that is the unanticipated consequences because of the response mechanisms and the stable institutional arrangement we just outlined. So clearly, there's a delicate balance between centralization and decentralization, and which lead to really unstable equilibria over time. So there's a persistent tension between the centralization of authority and the rule of law, and there is persistent tension between the arbitrary power and the rationalization of a rule-based bureaucracy. And there's tension between the arbitrary power and the professionalization in different areas of the contemporary society. Now, this book is drawing on the kind of conceptual framework and the issues I just outlined, and connect these to my empirical research and the case studies and ethnographic field work in China. So the book is organized in these three parts. The first part is more macro institutional mechanisms, discuss about the relationship between the state and the Chinese bureaucracy from a Weberian point of view, and discussed different mode of governance from a control right theory framework, as I just outlined, and it discussed campaign style mobilization. The second part of the book, the logical governance and the government behaviors, really focus on specific issues in the field work. For example, about bureaucratic bargaining, collusions among local governments, and governmental regulations in local areas, and how that imposes the multiple constraints in local government behaviors, and also how local governments exercise their power for downward extraction of resources. The third part, the logical governance and Chinese society, really is connecting the state with the society and see how internal logic really affects state-society relationship. Here, I provided a set of case studies. One is on the public goods provision in road pavement project. Another case is about local elections, village elections over 12 years span of time, and also collective action based on an organized interest. So that's the brief outline of the structure of this book. So let me summarize what I try to do in this book. The goal of my book is try to uncover the stable internal logic of governance in China. And I hope that this book provides a unified framework to account for the observations and phenomena across different areas and over time. And this book also aims to provide a set of analytical concepts, middle-range theoretical ideas, and models for sense-making, interpretation, and explanation of what I have observed in the fieldwork and in other cases in the literature. So I hope this book helps us update our knowledge about China's governance, and I also hope it will stimulate new lines of research. So let me stop here. I very much look forward to the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Professor Zhou, please ending the sharing. Okay, good. So thank you, Professor Zhou, for this wonderful presentation. Now I will invite our four discussants to deliver their comments. Each of you will have 10 minutes. I will start with Professor Mary Gallagher, who is a professor in political science at the University of Michigan. Mary, would you please start?
Thanks, Yang. And thanks for inviting me to this book talk. I'm really excited to discuss Xueguang's book. I have to say, this book is very impressive. I really love the framework. I think it's very ambitious, but at the same time, I think it makes a lot of sense to how we understand China. It's also very good at merging discussion of both imperial China and contemporary China, which is often quite difficult to do. I think you do it at a level of abstraction that works, and I would love to know if you're being heavily criticized by historians, but I thought it was quite effective. And it's also ambitious because it merges as Xueguang was just discussing, a discussion in the first part about the bureaucracy, the second part center local, and then the third part state society into a kind of a general theory. I've actually been teaching chapter 11 on organized interest and collective action for the last 20 years. I think it was written in 1993, which is when I first started graduate school. And I'm assuming, Xueguang, you can't be that much older than me. You were probably an assistant professor. So, I mean, that article is written about, it's really written about pre-reform China, but it continues to have, I think, a lot of logic for how collective action has worked in China generally, even in the reform period. So I have a number of questions. They are, I think, questions partly about how you see the book in terms of how graduate students in particular might use the book as inspiration, and also just some questions about interpretation of the general theory given what's happening in China right now. So most of my questions, the substantive questions, are about the period that we seem to be in, which is what you say very clearly is a period of re-centralization. So there are two questions I have that are more about the research design. So one question I have, and I would love for graduate students who are on this call to hear, is the method of participant observation. I think can be very, very powerful. Any kind of ethnography or interview type fieldwork can really enlighten us as to how the mechanisms in Chinese governance actually work. I'm really interested in whether you thought it was and I guess based on some of your remarks today, which I didn't understand before, it sounds like the fieldwork for this book ended at the beginning of the current period. And so I'm wondering whether or not you felt that there was a kind of Heisenberg effect, in the sense that, did you start to think that you were affecting the results? Did people understand that you're a famous professor, you're from Stanford University? Did you start to worry that the data that you were collecting was affected by, your presence? This is something obviously foreigners worry about all the time, and often impedes our ability to do effective fieldwork in China. And that's irregardless of the political constraints on fieldwork. So the second question I have, which is more about research design and the ambition of the book, I really like that the book takes into account the importance of scale, which is something I'm constantly saying to my colleagues in political science who study, European countries that are smaller than most Chinese provinces. So I think it's really great that you take that into account, because I think many people fail to take into account the scale of Chinese governance. But I want to know how you think about, you're doing research in it seems like mostly in a single place in northern China, but I think it makes sense and it can be generalized to the entire country. But at the same time, you also recognize Chinese diversity and uneven development. So do you think that your logic applies differently to different localities? Do you think that the argument it basically works for any part of China? So that's the second question, which is sort of about the design of the book. I have a couple of questions just about the argument in the book. I was really interested in the argument you make about the professionalization of society in conflict with move towards greater centralization. And you note that this has impacts on people, particularly in the white collar, in people in white collar work. So not about capital, big entrepreneurs, and really not about labor, but about this mid-range of people like us, medical doctors, lawyers, professors, journalists, and this increasing gap between you being in a professional organization or affiliation that drives you towards certain types of behavior, but yet we're in a moment in China right now where re-centralization is putting a lot of emphasis on political ideology and on ritual kind of performative compliance. And I'm really interested in what you think the implications of this are for not Chinese political governance, but for other types of governance. So when you go to see a doctor, or when you go to see a lawyer, or when you go to university, and how does this affect people's perceptions of these professions? Because there are lots of arguments in the political science discipline about, what are the groups that eventually become important to political change? And there's a book that, obviously Barrington Moore talks about the bourgeoisie, but more recent research, I think, really focuses on white-collar professionals as being particularly important to dissatisfaction with certain types of centralization. One of the questions is another question I have, which is about the substance of the book. And this is something I think that we all struggle with empirically, which is that you observe in the last decade, there's been increased centralization. There's a debate within political science whether or not this is deinstitutionalization or institutionalization and better kind of rule of law at the grassroots, whereas at the very elite level, there's sort of, kind of more arbitrary power. And so some people see kind of more effective central control as evidence of state capacity, which we would identify as a characteristic of modern bureaucratic states. But you argue that centralization impedes bureaucratic professionalization. But I think empirically right now in China, it's actually very hard to distinguish what is bureaucratic professionalization and what is centralization under arbitrary power. And I think about zero COVID, and I think about, the ability to get zero COVID compliance as actually kind of difficult to tell. Is this just a state with greater capacity and a more effective bureaucracy, or is really this about the centralization of power? And how can we distinguish these things when we're doing research? I think that's really important for students to understand. Okay, my last comment is about the conclusion. And I thought the conclusion was great because it is very open-ended, but it's not teleological. You're not talking about China going into, in a certain direction. It's not about China going in a kind of Western, competitive political system. It's not about necessarily China going towards a more authoritarian position, but it's very, very open-ended. And I'm wondering about what you think you talk about the last 40 years as an experiment that kind of departed from the past, and when China wasn't fluctuating so much between centralization and decentralization, it was largely more decentralized. Because during this period of the last 40 years, Chinese society changed dramatically. Chinese economy changed dramatically. So what do you see as the legacy of this period, given this new period of centralization and ideological control? Will it create new institutional options? Will it just fade away into the past? I think that is something that we're all wondering about right now. So thanks very much. I'm really happy to read the book.
Thank you so much, Mary, for your insightful comments and very interesting questions. So now I would like to invite Professor Yingyao Wang, Assistant Professor of Sociology from the University of Virginia, to have comments. Professor Wang, please.
Yes. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you, Xueguang and Tsinghua Sociology for organizing this book talk, and special thanks for Zhang and Yanfei for putting this talk together and for giving me this opportunity to comment on Professor Zhou's latest book. So for someone who, like me, who also have worked on tracing the evolution of the Chinese bureaucracy, Professor Zhou's work has been an excellent model and a great source of inspiration for my own work. So this book really kind of provides a grand synthesis of Professor Zhou's early and latest writings on this topic, and with a new and a heightened level of theoretical ambition towards providing overarching explanation of basically how Chinese government works, as you see in the presentation. And because of time, of course, also because astonishing clarity of the argument in this book, I think I will not get into the details of the richness of the argument. So the book actually does an amazing job summarizing the argument along the way. And there's actually not a single page where the argument was not clear. So I will just here maybe highlight some, and certainly not all, what I think are the book's central contributions. First, I think the book's analytical approach is really bold and simultaneously methodical. It identified this central and fundamental tension in Chinese way of governing, namely the one between centralized authority and the local governance. And this observation may echo many sort of casual observations or popular understandings of the Chinese government and its problems. But the author is really able to go from there and explain that this overarching logic actually sets off a few generalized institutional responses, including, variable coupling and complementary between formal and informal institutions, and the campaign-style mobilization, which in turn gave rise to a wide variety of government behavior ranging from bargaining to collusion. So I think the author here really kind of turns this intuitive insights into building a very sophisticated analytical scaffolding. And in the end, I found this tension response behavior model is parsimonious enough to generate a theory, but also very flexible and copious to accommodate. This book exemplifies kind of period-specific and policy-specific variations and processes and change. So relate to this point, and I think the theoretical model is as mainly the precise also because the book makes good use of the tools from organizational sociology. So questions that are commonly explored in organizational sociology are well resonating in this book, such as the issue of bounding and rationality, principal-agent relations, organization-environment interactions, and the allocation of attention, resources, and so forth. So I think the use of organizational analysis in this book really has two advantages. First, in some ways, it kind of productively defamiliarizes some of the phenomena we're kind of accustomed to explaining, such as centralization and decentralization, that in this case, Professor Zhou used the idea of coupling. And another concept I found was very generative, the control right. We know that property rights is a very complicated issue in China, and also the right of govern is multi-layered, and there's division label between them. So control right is very productive as a meso-level concept to unpack this phenomenon. And I think the second advantage associated with using organizational analysis is really make China an effective case for comparison. So it really kind of gave us a shared problems to work with and a shared language to talk about the issues. And in some ways, it does the discipline a great service that how we can translate our heuristic understanding of China and a very context-specific knowledge into meso-level explanation that can travel, that also can make China a case for comparative work. So I have perhaps a few questions I also would like to ask that derives from the book and also inspired by the conclusion, and then that perhaps can help us think more about China's past and future. And the first question is that I think the book raised a really compelling puzzle that how a country, with a size comparable to that of Europe can be effectively governed. And then the author kind of productively I mentioned that this, there is a tension, and this tension does generate instabilities and the problems and constant negotiations, in some cases, waste the resources and also traumatic political events. But I was also wondering to what extent, and this is a thought kind of worth entertaining, is that precisely because of the tension and the readjustment, and precisely because the combination of formal and informal institutions, there was some kind of built-in resilience in the Chinese model, so to speak, that holds China actually together in spite of its size and its diversity and all that. So the book also mentioned this sort of the kind of trade-off between efficiency and stability. I wonder whether maybe in some period efficiency was a preferable goal, and in some period the stability, should it be the concern here? So to what extent we should trade these trade-off also as a source of resilience and adaptation and flexibility in some ways. So my second question is kind of relate to Mary's observations about some recent new political and social and economic development. Namely is that re-centralization and to some extent the re-centralization is also translate to, as the book also observes, that a bureaucratization of Chinese society and also the rise of ministerial powers and then the rise of the importance of expertise and technologies and techniques of governing in instituting effective governance, and also this idea of technology assistant governance. So I wonder if this kind of professionalization of governing, not in sense of expanding autonomy, but in a sense of kind of new institutionalist pursuit of legitimacy, is also kind of working in the direction of instilling a new form of legitimacy in the local government, probably more prominently in the central government, that add another variable, sort of another phenomenon to reckon with into the Chinese study of governance here. And then the third question is actually about short-termism. So I'm really convinced that all these phenomena, including how Chinese government kind of muddle through all these solutions, and then there's constant readjustment between central and the local relations, and also there's this flexibility in implementation, there's a changing task environment and goal setting, that all together kind of contribute to the search for short-term solutions in China. But in some ways, as we observe sort of around the world, this is almost become a universal complaint among many countries that countries today are increasingly kind of driven by short-term vision, the short-term solutions. As a matter of fact, that I would imagine that American policymakers might envy in some ways or complain about the lack of steadiness in their governance system, precisely how the American governance system is set up. So I wonder how this Chinese idea of short-term achievement and a short-term kind of driven sense of horizon or governance is different from that we see in the West. So let me just close by saying that I really enjoy reading this book, and then it was highly productive for me to think through my own research, especially on my research on the central economic bureaucracy. And I highly recommend this book to everyone to read, and I will definitely use that in my Chinese society in the sociology of development course. Thank you again.
Thank you, Yingyao, for this wonderful comment. And now I'd like to invite Professor Fei Yan, sociologist from Tsinghua University, to deliver his comment. Fei, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Zhang Yang, and thank you so much for Professor Xueguang's very insightful talk. I really like Professor Xueguang's argument that campaign-style mobilization is a key mechanism of governance in China. And Professor Xueguang's argument is actually based on his observation that the Chinese government frequently relies on large-scale campaigns to mobilize public participation and achieve policy goals. And these campaigns are often organized around specific issues such as environmental protection or poverty reduction, and involve a large range of actors, including government officials, civil society organizations, and ordinary people. And based on Professor Xueguang's framework, I would like to extend two more scenarios. The first scenario is from historical angle. It's based on historical stories. So although the power struggle between the central and the local governments is a fundamental tension, it's a persistent contradiction, but I think the long-term survival of the state still occupies the dominant position, while the local power is in a relatively passive position. So I would like to give an example of the Cultural Revolution. So during the Cultural Revolution, the core issue of power was not the mutual dependence. It's not the conflict between the central and the local government. Instead, we can observe that the central government bypassed the middle level or bypassed the intermediate bureaucratic level, and they directly establish a power base among the grassroots masses. So we can say the central power utilized Chairman Mao's charisma and the emotional belief of the masses to establish a charismatic authority and further consolidating the legitimacy of central power. So during this particular historical period, we can say that the main targets of the many struggle sections and of many political campaigns were the so-called capitalist rulers, 走资派, and other reactionary forces. So during the Cultural Revolution, this type of power operation should be seen as a very extreme expansion of central power. And the second scenario is coming from the lessons from what happened during the past 3 years during the pandemic. And for a really long time, we have been talking about concentrating our efforts to accomplish great things, 集中力量办大事. But in the past 2 to 3 years, we have found that government power is penetrating into every perspective, at the grassroots level. And at first, it was great governance, 网格化治理, great governance. But I feel like it has become or transformed into micro great governance, 微网格治理. So from great governance to micro great governance. And especially in the past 2 years, I have conducted several field trips to the county level, and the local government officials think it is time to cut neighborhoods into micro grids. And especially after the pandemic, the government felt that the grid cells were still too large. In other words, the boundaries of our neighborhoods were too broad, and the government couldn't penetrate into the grassroots communities at every corner. So therefore, the micro-grid governance was gradually implemented, and the government used all kinds of means to extend the tentacles of power into the local affairs and people's daily life. So when the tentacles of governance continue to penetrate, so it is transformed from concentrating our efforts to accomplish great things to concentrating our efforts to accomplish small things, 集中力量办小事, which means the government forces penetrate into people's daily life. So we understand, according to our understanding, our daily life is so trivial and has nothing to do with politics. But from the perspective of the government, this will lead to our daily lives and the private space being continuously touched by political power. I think this is a very frightening thing. So therefore, today's campaign style governance has become micro level great governance. And even the daily life, our ordinary people would cover up are exposed to public space for political management. So I also would like to propose this new scenario to Professor Xueguang, and would like to hear your comment on this new development after pandemic. So this is my comment. Thank you so much for Professor Zhang Yang's host and Professor Xueguang's insightful talk.
Thank you, Fei, for very interesting observation from China. And now we have our fellow discussant, Professor Zhang. And she is a historian and a associate professor of history at Ohio State University. Professor Zhang, please.
Okay, can you hear me now? We had a blackout and I was dropped, my line was dropped. And can you hear me quite clearly? Okay, great. Thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation. I'm just a historian of Ming China, and I'm still learning a great deal from political sociologists and sociologists in general. So this book, I've been reading scholarship like this, especially such solidly researched and just wonderfully theorized book. It really helped me think about what I study, because I think that the distinctions Professor Zhou tries to make here forced me to think about if these distinctions also existed in Ming China. More specifically, I think Ming and Qing are actually quite different in many ways in terms of the bureaucratic mechanisms. So I will just, I guess, there are many things I like about this and find inspiring. I hope to think more carefully in the future, but I guess I will just offer a few comments and questions, focusing more on the sort of historical changes and continuities and a few points that Professor Zhou made in this book. So it's both exciting and scary to read about the continuity from pre-modern imperial China to contemporary China. Exciting because I can still say Ming bureaucracy matters. Scary because I think we all want to see changes. Political changes, institutional changes should also happen along with socioeconomic, technological changes. But if there's so much continuity, then we should we're in trouble. So I really appreciate this kind of really nicely woven sort of the line of discussion about continuity and discussion of the changes, how these are woven together in this narrative, and I was really surprised to read this part where you discussed the greater dependence of the bureaucrats on the state. I actually thought it would be the opposite. The case you're making here is you used in that particular comparison you mentioned, you refer to the Mingqing. I will just use Mingqing here. Officials as scholar officials, if they had another way out, if they didn't serve in the government as bureaucrats, they could just become scholars. But the officials were bureaucrats. Now they didn't have this other identity. So this is actually, I'm still thinking about it. I haven't made up my mind about whether I completely agree with this or not, but I think this is a really interesting point. But I initially thought they would, in modern times, they would have more options. So I wondered if this has something to do with the specialization of the bureaucrats, or if it has something to do with the production of the bureaucrats. Why do you want to emphasize sort of a scholar identity in addition to the bureaucratic identity in the pre-modern times, imperial times, and now not other non-bureaucratic roles? I'm very curious about that, and I want to continue thinking about it in my own research. So related to that, you talk about in the imperial bureaucratic monarchy, the officials they followed both the bureaucratic authority and the Confucian morality. And this is also something I wanted to think about structurally in my own research on Ming bureaucracy. I feel we know that Confucian morality had become part of bureaucratic authority, although I think Ming historians should do more to separate the bureaucratic from the political. But just based on what we already know in the existing scholarship, Confucian morality has become part of the bureaucratic authority. But in the contemporary China, that seems to be missing, or something else is happening in this mechanism, in this combination. I'm very curious to hear about that change from imperial China to contemporary China. And again, related to that, I was intrigued by your distinction you made about between the state and the bureaucracy, Chinese state and Chinese bureaucracy. And you said in imperial China, the state, you are using monarchy as to refer the state, you are using monarchy to refer to it, and in today's top leaders. So I wondered, I like the distinction very much. I'm not sure if I'm thoroughly agreed with it, but I like the fact that you are making effort to separate these two. But monarchy in imperial, at least in the Ming, it could not, I think it was very different from just the ruler, the emperor, or the royal house. It's basically the senior advisors, the top officials. So in that sense, there's also some kind of it's a cluster of leaders, basically. So I'm curious to hear more about that distinction you're making. And my purpose of asking this question is to really try to think about if there's some similarities in the context I work on, and also in whether the production, there's so much effort put into the production of elite bureaucracy or elite bureaucrats in pre-modern China. And I think that difference between the elite bureaucrats and non-elite bureaucrats, that's something I'm also very curious about. And I wonder if that production, different kinds of production of elite bureaucrats and non-elite bureaucrats continued in contemporary China in the context of your own analysis. And I ask this question because I don't know, because your research field work, if I remember correctly, was done in between 2005 and 2015, right? So I don't know how much of this Xi government's emphasis on the moral cultivation it started to really take off. But I have noticed, especially recently, this it's even stronger than before. This emphasis on family values and family roles and family virtues, all these things that I am familiar with in the study of the Ming elite. Now it's part of this elite bureaucratic education, and I'm just wondering if you have any thought on that. To me, I asked this question because I'm really curious. I also love how you in the essay the three lenses and the Weberian and Confucian lenses to study bureaucracy. I loved that very much, but I also wondered about the moral or spiritual element of the Confucian bureaucracy, because I think it's not just emotions. There's so much intellectual vigor, and there's so much spiritual vigor in this kind of bonding between the state, if you use monarchy to describe it at the time, and the elite bureaucrats, at least in the main. So I wonder if that spiritual vigor, that intellectual vigor is absent now in contemporary China, in contemporary bureaucracy. I have many other questions, but I think I've already used a lot of time. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Yin, for this wonderful comment from a Ming history, historical perspective. And last thing, I will let Professor Zhou to briefly respond to one of those interesting comments. But before that, I want to make use 1 minute to say something about the pilot. We invite historians and political scientists, in addition to sociologists, as a discussion, partly because we want to make this pilot an interdisciplinary discussion and also transnational, somehow cross-linguistic communities for this very important book, and to have all kinds of audience and panelists to join our discussion. And also, I want to say our pilot happens at a very interesting time. Just 1 day before the open of the 14th National People's Congress in China. So that would make our discussion more relevant and important. Some of you may notice today that is a report about China's COVID action, some sort of story. So I think it very much echoes what Professor Zhou discussed in his book. So I may ask some questions from my perspective, when after Professor Zhou respond to our discussions. So Professor Zhou, I would now invite you to quickly respond to the four discussions. Maybe you have 10 minutes. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Zhang Yang. And thank you all for really wonderful commentary and questions, and really raise a lot of interesting issues. Some of these I encountered over the years, but some of these are very new, especially in the new context. Excuse me. So let me just very quickly comment on, respond to some of your questions and your comments. If I miss something, please come back to me at all. I hope very much we all join the discussion together. Okay. First, Mary, responding to your question about how historians respond to my work, it turns out I made a lot of new friends among historians because of my research. They not necessarily always agree with me, but I seek their advice because their research informed me a great deal. Looking at what I was observing in a contemporary China, but reading their work, seeing similarities, parallels in history, that really helped a great deal. So I have been communicating with historians, especially in China, and because of that, I was also invited to participate in their discussions about related issues, and I was asked to review their books, and a lot of things happened since then. So I very much enjoy this cross-fertilization because of this. But again, they are critical. Some of them are critical with the way I discuss a certain characterization of the periods or overgeneralization of the historical patterns and so on and so forth. So this is very good. I would call it very healthy tension between social science approach and historian's approach. So let me quickly respond to your question about the method of participation. And this is one thing I find so valuable. Before I do this participatory observation, I never, I studied China through a quantitative point of view. So when I started the field work, I just thought, I'll stay there for a period of time. Then I feel I will get to know everything. Then I can, be informed, and then that'll be the end of the project. But it turns out so many interesting things happen and it continue. For example, when the collective debt because of the road pavement project, they lasted more than 3 years, 5 years. It's still ongoing. I mean, that gives me a real pause to think about how we social scientists should approach these so-called events and so-called sequence of events. Because even you discuss with you talk to some local villagers or local cadres, and he or she will give you a story. But sometime later, he will repeat that same story, but in very different lights. So over time, you realize that people do change. Even the same person change their stories in different ways because of the circumstances, because of the kind of things he wants to do with that story. And so for that, I realized you really have to stay there longer time and also try to really get very close to them so they feel comfortable to discuss these issues with you. So that leads me to the second issue, Mary, you asked about they recognize my identity being a professor. At that time, I was at Hong Kong. And so they would be feel uncomfortable. So my influence, their way of talking to me, it turned out, at least the way I feel about it, is that because I've been there so often and got to know them so well, and I live there literally with them the 24 hours. This with local officials, local cadres in their township government compound, and the villages are just nearby. They walk a few minutes, you went to a villager's home. So in that sense, I think that we have got so familiar with each other. Probably never, well, at least I know they always see me as a Professor Zhou rather than, one of their neighbor. But I think people feel comfortable enough. Many times, I'm not the key person in that discussion or group. I would just sit there listening to their discussions and their debates among themselves about issues, about whatever things. And so I'm not pursuing these events. I let these events come to me most of the time. So in that sense, I think probably that issue is less serious than normally would be the case. But that really requires time commitment to make people feel comfortable around you or you around them. So that's responding to the second question. And the question about professionalization is, I think, something really interesting. And I have been thinking about that partly because my earlier research, at the very beginning, after my graduation, I did some research on professionalization in the US context. And that I read that literature that really influenced me when I think about the Chinese case. It's not about the village I study. It's really about the larger pictures, because we heard so many things about the relationship between doctors and the patients, between professors and the students, between the masters and their apprentices. All these different kind of relationships really involve the element about how professionals behave and whether they can make independent judgment or not. And this really becomes, I think, a very big issue as we now realize, for example, in the pandemic, and suddenly people questions: Do we listen to these professionals because their judgments, their whatever evaluation they give seems so off the mark and so distant from what people feel in their everyday experience, and so that becomes really important issue. And the other issue, as we all know, as we work in universities, the reputation of the professors in their own research, in their own everyday conduct also becomes highly problematic. I think in many ways, this is what I would call the politicization of society really makes everything so political that professionals have very little role to play in that space. So that, to me, is a very major issue. I think it still leaves room for us to do a lot of good research on these along these lines. And I'm not quite sure in the U.S. context, people talk about white-collar professionals, more or less as the autonomous groups pursuing their self-interest. In the Chinese case, I think people are more care about what is their connection with the larger political context, and what is their role to play, or whether they compare with the traditional 士大夫 official scholars, and relative to more today the bureaucrats very much follow the political lines. I think these contrasts seems pretty stark, and people ask questions about how to evaluate their performance and their judgment. So that's the issue about professionalization. And so let me say a few words about the conclusion. In the concluding chapter, I was discussing in a way implication of my study for the future of China. And there I did make a prediction or make a statement or express a view that I thought the last 40 years of economic reform and opening up seems like so extraordinary, different from the past, Chinese past, and it's almost like it is experiment that's very unlikely to continue. And remember, this book was submitted, or the manuscript was submitted in 1213. Actually, that statement was made probably in an article even earlier than that. So it's not about the current situation, but just looking at the kind of changes that China experienced, and also the resistance by that time becomes so evident. And I was just expressing a concern that it seems like so extraordinary. It's not like it seems very inconsistent with what the kind of trajectory we observed in China's past. So of course, I hope they will has a breakthrough, but maybe that's a high tall order. So let me move on to some other comments from other panelists, so we have more time to discuss other issues. Yingyao, so thank you for these really great comments. And let me just very briefly respond to your question. I think certainly you made the observation that the combination of interdependence between formal and informal institutions may actually provide resilience to the Chinese governance structures or practice. I fully agree on that point. And that's actually is one thing I think I also try to advocate, especially after the book was completed. Since then, I wrote several articles on the informal institutions in the Chinese bureaucracy. So the point I want to make, and I pretty much I think it's your point here, is that in the past, people tend to think informal institutions, informal practice is a bad thing, especially from the top leader's point of view. But in my view, in my mind, informal institutions are complementary to formal institutions. And without informal institutions, the formal institution will collapse, will run into crisis right away. It is informal institutions that provide so much flexibility to allow formal institutions to shield up rigidity can still survive. That's my take. So I wrote an article on 帝国逻辑, where I claim that the interdependence of the coexistence and the interdependence of formal and informal institutions is at the core of the law of the empire, or the 帝国逻辑, the logic of the empire. So I fully agree on that point. And you asked questions about with the new development on technologies, on many other things, in what ways the bureaucratic governance issues will be affected. I think this is really a tremendous new challenge of course for the rulers, for those who exercise governance, but also for researchers. I mean, if we think about what happens in the last just few months with the so-called the Chat GPT and many other developments, artificial intelligence, it almost makes me feel like major changes is really around the corner. Not only in terms of how you govern people or how we are governed by AI. I mean these are really tremendous challenges for us to recognize, and really for social scientists to really keep a close eye on these new technological developments and their implications for both the governance, both for those who govern and for those who are being governed. Okay. I'll skip some other issues and come to Yanfei. I think you made really interesting observations. This is great seeing that so-called campaign-style mobilization, really it has been such a central feature in the Chinese politics and Chinese way of organizing, governing in almost every affairs. But especially the way you talk about in the more recent pandemic era, when mobilization, of course, mobilization in response to crisis probably is the most effective way. And I think in the early period, and the mobilization really played a very important role for the early success in containing the pandemic crisis. And of course, the problem is that the logic will carry through without limit, right? At least with a different logic than what we would like to see. So it may carry to another extreme, and that also it becomes much more pushed, shaped not by professional evaluation, going back to the early point about what is the right boundary, right extent of mobilization and for what purpose, right? I think your point about 集中力量办小事 I think it's extremely important point, right? Because the logic behind that is that once the power is available, the tools are available, and it can be exercised all over the place, not based on view of what well-defined policy targets, but by those people who have the ability to use these tools, right? So these are the ramification is really huge. I think we all need to rethink about this set of issues. Yeah. Okay. Zhang Ying, again, it's so good to hear from a historian. So thank you for making all these comments. And I agree with you. The historical continuity is really scary. It's really disappointing. And we hope there's something else more fresh for us to study. I guess your point about the dependence of the bureaucrats on the state, this is actually one major point I made in this book. It's really talking about the relationship between the state and the bureaucracy. I want to make that distinction, not necessarily confining the state only to the monarchy, but in general, it's about the top leaders, including what you call the collective of leaders at the top. Okay, but the contrast is really the local bureaucrats at the lower levels. For example, even in the earlier Chinese history, in the Ming and Qing dynasty, even when the local officials were dispatched from very top, from Libu, and they move around all over the places, but they also have very different hierarchical levels, and so they have different interest groups around them. So their connection with the very top leaders is still with a varying social distance. So I'm trying to make contrast between the state and local bureaucracy, try to argue that the relationship itself need to be studied, need to be examined. So for example, in the Chinese context, especially in the contemporary era, when we think about what I call upward accountability, that is, the local bureaucrats depending on their supervisors for careers, for survival. And especially in the contemporary era, and this is going back to another point you made, they don't have the kind of exit option like in the early eras, when they can retreat into say scholar life, and they can retire and going back to their countryside and become a gentry leader in the gentry class. But here in contemporary China, bureaucrats, first very hard for them to leave their officialdom, then become some of them retired, then go to other being appointed in private companies and so on and so forth. But these are very rare. So I still think that making that distinction and also try to understand that relationship between the two really goes a long way for us to understand how the Chinese bureaucracy works or not working in other ways. There are so many really interesting, good questions. And the other thing about, you mentioned about this spirits and the intellectual aspects of the bureaucrats, especially now going back, you are talking about the historical angle. Actually, just today, yesterday, I received an email from a student, our PhD student, asking this question. Says, what about the moral judgments of officials in contemporary China? To what extent they are rational, just pursuing their self-interest, as the typical social science literature portray them, or they have some their value judgment, moral judgment, and some of these affect the way they decide how to deal with their task at hand. And he asked me for what kind of literature do we have on this matter. I thought about it, and please others help me to think about this. I couldn't think about any significant literature on contemporary China, but I think about historical China, there are really a number of really good studies on how local bureaucrats were influenced by Confucian culture, ethics, and how they would actually treat both, serve the emperor, but also defending so-called Confucian ethics and principle as really both are important, and sometimes they are in tension, and local officials have to address these tensions. So these are things really important issues, and I wondered why it never surfaced in contemporary research. And that I think itself becomes a very interesting question to ask for us to think about why our research never think that's a really important issue. I have not thought about that, and I have not read anything that focuses on the moral judgment of these officials. So I think this is a really good question for us to think about. You better learn from historians and how we can revisit this set of issues in contemporary context. So let me just stop here. Please come back to me if you have other questions, but I really hope that we can jointly discuss issues. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhou. And we still have 30 minutes, which is good. And now we are open to Q&A. I think a number of audience have raised questions in the Q&A. I have chosen 3 from Q&A and post in the webinar chat. Professor Zhou, can you say the questions? I selected 3 questions in the chat, and you can.
Okay. I see a number of them. So
yeah.
Which one should I?
You choose whatever you want to. I would give this flexibility to you. You don't need to respond to all of them because we have more than 20 questions. I choose whatever you think interesting to answer.
Okay, so one I was reading say, thank you for sharing the story of healthy tension between you and the historians. Could you share with us which parts historians might think your argument is over theorized? Actually, okay. So here, we have historians on the panel. So please correct me if I overstated anything. Historians, at least the historian trained in the Chinese tradition, actually they really do not like theory. Okay. So the point is that if you have too many theories, you will be influence when you select, the historical evidence. Wang, for example, in his book called 自史三书, made a very explicit point. He said we should refuse to adopt social science theory. And the argument is that once you are influenced by these theoretical perspectives, you'll be very selective in choosing historical evidence. And so that's one. Certainly, there are people who made that point. Recently, I was asked to review a book written by a historian on 中国历史上的理甲制度. I forgot this specific 乡里制度, 中国古代乡里制度. So it's really from the Dongzhou all the way to Qing dynasty. This is really a wonderful book. 800 pages long. And so I wrote my review and my comments, and then the author who also wrote a response, toward the end of his response, he said, this pretty much his very artistic rhetoric. He says that he reminded a saying in his historical circle that you stand up from your own garden, you look at all these beautiful things around, but then you realize you still need to attend to your own garden. So you just lower down and work on your own garden. And I think probably that's one view. They think that social science probably, but being theoretical, also means that being selective, whereas the historian's style probably should be exhaustive. I don't know, probably the wrong interpretation of this. So that's one side of the story. On the other side, I also met many historians who really discussed with me about all these implications of what I argued about contemporary world and how that was reflected or helped them to think about the historical period they study. I remember there's one historian, he's not talking about specific things regarding my own research, but he says, he learned so much about just observing what is going on in contemporary China that helped him to understand the kind of phenomena, historical phenomena he studied in Qin, pre-Qin dynasty, pre-Qin period. Because a lot of things, there's a resemblance or reminiscence of what is happening, historical legacy. And so in many ways, I think there's a really healthy, not only tension, but also healthy mutual stimulation of ideas, topics, a way of thinking between historians and social scientists. And I have benefited a lot, really a lot, from studying, reading historians' research. Actually, since I finished this book, I spent considerable of time reading historical research because I want to trace the historical roots of the Chinese bureaucracy. And I published several articles since then. I hope eventually I will collect into another book, but mostly focus on historical a way of thinking about Chinese bureaucracy. Really is mostly taking historians' work seriously and try to learn from them and try to think about continuity, unfortunately, the continuity between what we observe today and what happens in Chinese history. Please jump in. I don't want to be the only person talking.
Very good. We did like to push this interdisciplinary study of Chinese bureaucracy from all kinds of perspective, but historian, historical sociologist, historical political scientist. And I think this is a emerging field, and that there should be many more studies. And we also would like to invite a lot of non-China specialists, to contribute to the field. We are organizing some pilots in conference, in virtual pilots, to invite some non-China specialists, but great comparative scholars to contribute to the field. Now, there are other questions in the chat. Maybe you can pick one more to answer, Professor Zhou. There is a question about, for example, about the framework makes sense from a geographic point of view, but is it that different within the Chinese context? Would love to hear more from the state society angle. I mean, I don't know whether you want to answer this question or there is another one.
Makes sense for geographic point of view, but is different with the Chinese context. I'm sorry, I may missed the which question you were referring to.
Just the question just you read. I think this question is about the variations, right? Within China, and the framework. It asked about the any difference within the Chinese context.
So I guess the question is, my focus is on the framework focus on the relationship between the state and bureaucracy, or the central government and local government. Would that same framework applies to state-society relationship? Is that the question? I mean, is that?
Yeah, I think that's at least a part of the second part of the question.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Certainly, my focus, because I adopt an organizational approach, and my focus really is about mostly focus on the local governments and how they interact with upwards with their supervisors, and especially in terms of interacting with the state policies imposed from a top-down process. But I do think also the third part of this book really to try to demonstrate that the same logic also applies in the state-society relationship. That is to say, the local government plays such an important role in many aspects of local affairs. Right, so we talk about provision of public goods. We talk about local election, and of course, social protest resistance taking place in the grassroots level. Almost always, local government played an important role. And in more recent years, local governments, because of the centralization of resources, and then trickle down from top to local levels, but also with mandates on what kind of policy targets, what kind of issues should be addressed. So I think the government influence into rural areas, into society, like the Qingling dynamics that Yang Fei talked about, really become much more important. And because of that, the bureaucratic logic is also diffused stretched into different corners of the society. So in that sense, I think the same logic probably becomes more visible, important because of the larger trend of bureaucratization of society, as I discussed in the latter part of that book. So yeah, that's my a quick response thought about this. But I really want to hear from my colleagues on the panel what you think. I mean, you are all experts in this area, please.
Okay, maybe before Professor Zhou answers the third question, I as a organizer and a chair, I want to offer some of my question for Professor Zhou and for other panelists, especially for Mary. The reason I saw Mary one day you post something about Professor Zhou's 1993 ASR article during the protest, right? So I thought there is some commonality of the interest between us, and that's why we have this wonderful panel. And I myself is trained as a historical sociologist. So like in my some of my observation of Chinese state and bureaucracy is very much from historical perspective. But like Professor Zhou and Professor Gallagher and other professors, I'm a sociologist. I'm not a historian. So my question here is first question is sort of a disciplinary question. We have different ways to study the Chinese state and the bureaucracy, such as political scientists have their own ways, right? We now political scientists do a lot of experiments and also a lot of quantitative studies. And historians use archives, a lot of very detailed narratives about the state. And the sociologists, like Professor Zhou, from the organizational perspective. And for myself, I often observe the Chinese state from long-term historical perspective, making some comparison across dynasties, between Maoist age and today. So my question is, what's the distinctive advantage and a disadvantage of each kind of method? How can we, have more sort of, more productive conversation and among us, and how can we learn from each other from different approaches? This is some sort of different question. Another question is more related to the contemporary events, as I just mentioned. There's a report about the China's response to the COVID, right? It says the new premier made some sort of decisive move to end the zero COVID policy, and but there could be two different explanations. So one scenario from the report and from a lot of people on Twitter, on social media says, maybe this is sort of some division of labor or even division of power. Somehow, it sounds like China has a semi-presidential system, So that's one explanation. That's, the premier had a lot of autonomy, So he proposed the idea to end it. So it's somehow related to discussion between Professor Zhou and Zhang Ying about how the monarchy system functions, right? Whether there is some division of power between the emperor and his chancellors, right? This is one explanation. It's a sort of division of power. But then the other explanation, which I probably prefer, is maybe that means the new premier is more trusted by Xi, and she is more willing to delegate some authority to his trusted officials, right? So the policy change is not necessarily a bureaucratic insurgency against the leader, but some sort of a delegation of authority from the president to some of his trust officials. And so this could be a totally different explanation. So I want to hear some of your thoughts, Professor Zhou, but also Mary and Professor Zhang Ying. How would you analyze this dramatic policy change from your distinctive perspective? Thank you.
Let me give you my quick response. I'm so glad I'm a sociologist, by which I mean I study grassroots, as I don't have to speculate about what's going on at the very top level. And that's often this is really what I think. I think many times people, when they say, I want to interview you on this issue, on that topic, I said, look, I never studied these issues, and I never have information about these issues. So what I can do is speculate. If I speculate, I have to speculate as any other person in this society. There's nothing special from me. But I think this is why sociologists, especially when they either collect systematic data or they can conduct participatory observations, really close to the sources of information, and try to collect information, try to make sense of it, and try to interpret and offer interpretation. At least it makes me feel comfortable. I feel so after my field work, I really feel comfortable because every sentence I said in that book has some empirical basis on it based on my experience working in that area. Historians, of course, collect information, archival data or some other sources, including all these, I guess, what do you call it? 发掘. I don't know the English word for it. So this, in many ways, Mary, I want to just follow up this question: how political scientists can discuss about top leaders' issues while they know so little about what's really going on?
That's a very difficult question. And I myself don't study politics. So, I think some of it is a combination of guessing and also some combination of having sources. So at the very elite level, I think there's much more similarity between good political scientists and good journalists. So people who are talking to a lot of people. But it's difficult to tell the reliability of the information that they get. And the recent articles talking about zero COVID and the ending of zero COVID, there's one in, I think, Reuters today, which talks about that it was about Li Chang, going against what she wanted. I mean, I have no idea. It's very hard to verify. So it's not really social science, I think. Maybe it's necessary, but I think it's a different type of research. I have a question on the total opposite end of the spectrum, which is about how somebody like you, Professor Zhou, who's a quantitative sociologist, and then doing this kind of ethnography, when you think about, particularly younger scholars who are, often forced into a much more quantitative and at least in political science research that is mainly about causal inference, which I don't know if causal inference has infected sociology in the same way it's infected political science. And I'm using the verb infected deliberately because it's like a disease. How can you make your arguments? How could younger people, younger graduate students who need to do work that is quantitative in some way, could they take your arguments and turn them into quantitative studies, or studies that are focusing on causality in the way that economists and I think quantitative sociologists think about causality?
Let me have a quick response. Yes, actually, I very much think that a lot of things I discussed in that book, whether explicitly stated or implication of these arguments, can be quantitatively studied. I do recall, I think it's Ying, Zhang Ying asked this question, or Yingyao, I couldn't remember exactly, but the question about the exit, the comparison of the possibility of exit from the Ming, say, bureaucrats in the Ming Dynasty or Qing Dynasty historically, or the current bureaucrats. And that's easy to study. Even if we keep track of these bureaucrats' records, their resume, whatever, well, we can easily answer that question. And there are many other things, actually, I can easily think about implication. I thought about it, actually. It's just too much work to do by one person. And to be honest, I lose interest in this kind of research. I'd rather do field work or some other line of work that more satisfactory to me at this stage of my career. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, I think, there are comparative advantage of being qualitative and quantitative. And individuals, many of us are have strong preferences. When we want to do qualitative work or we want to quantitative work, and people are endowed with different kinds of skills, preferences, things like that. So I don't think there's a really one has to do both. If you can do one real well, you contribute to knowledge in that way. But I also think at times, if we can do both, these are even more wonderful because you really understand the limits of the other side. So whenever now I think people argue about the limit of qualitative research versus the limit of quantitative research, I think I can see both sides. I can see where they come from, the point of argument, but also I can see why there's a problem with that kind of arguments. and because they didn't see the other side of the, put in the shoes of the other side. So I think if possible, once in a while, you do want to shift from these different research styles and try to gain some different perspective. And I have learned a great deal by doing that.
Thank you, Professor Zhou. So now we have another question from the audience, which is for another historian from University of Toronto, Professor Chen Li. He has a very interesting question. I invited Professor Chen to join us as a panelist. Maybe Professor Chen, you want to ask a question? You want to ask a question by yourself?
Okay, sure. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Actually, also, this is my first time after, 2 or 3 months to attend any academic events because I actually originally intended to schedule a public lecture by Professor Zhou on his new book. Because of the things that has recently happened. So we haven't done that yet, but I'm very glad to hear this almost a roundtable discussion. But again, congratulations, Professor Zhou, on your new book. My question is a follow-up on some of the things you highlighted, didn't go into detail. That is I think I forgot whether that was also discussing your Chinese version of the book, but I expected that you have made already a substantial revision after the Chinese copy of the book. My question is, to what extent the tensions between the centralization of the imperial power and also the kind of the practical need for flexibility in local governance contributed to or even caused what you call the limited rationalization of the bureaucracy, but also professionalization. I suppose you meant that by that the professionalization of the bureaucrats. If the latter is your actual argument, then my own book, hopefully I will finish the book sometime in the near future, is about the professionalization of the probably non-official members of the local governments. That is, for example, what I call the legal advisors, but also there are others, administrative specialists, who are not always part of the official staff members of the local government, but they were in many ways, I would argue, they were professionalized simply just because they made a living working in those capacities, and they were trained, especially the legal advisors. They were trained at least for 2 to 4 years. I think they were more professionalized than many of the lawyers who have got license in, for example, state of California without going to law school. That's still possible in the United States. So in many ways, and also there's and some scholars have argued that bureaucrats, scholar officials, even though they didn't specialize in law or even administrative work, they were also professionalized in the sense that they were, they prepared for the exams for many years. And then they became professional officials in a sense. They made a living by being officials. So that's a different way of professionalization. So I'm very curious to hear more of your thoughts about to what extent you think the tensions either derailed the process of professionalization or derailed the process of rationalization of bureaucracy, even though I think actually if we are going to apply Weberian notion about rationalization, I think the late inter-Chinese bureaucracy was over-rationalized. And the imperial government itself is over-rationalized because I'm writing on multiple book projects. Some of them were actually have a common theme, that is the excessive documentation that supported the whole imperial administrative edifice. That is, almost every kind of work has to be documented meticulously. So that is much more, in a sense, rationalized than probably most of the certainly counterparts in their own time, and probably more rationalized than one may argue the PRC government in our own time. So I would very much appreciate hearing your thoughts on how those different kinds of probably takes on both the bureaucratization, rationalization, and actually also professionalization might somehow push the arguments further or somewhat in somewhat different directions. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Sorry for taking too much time.
Okay. Let me have a brief response, and I also want to invite Zhang Ying to the discussion because you are the expert as a historian on this topic. These are really wonderful questions. I think the way you talk about professionalization, bureaucratization, and what is the third
rationalization.
Rationalization. Okay. But so let me first, please let me know once your book comes out. I won't read it, okay, because this really addresses issues very close to my heart. In organization literature, we do make a distinction between bureaucratization and professionalization. Bureaucratization is much more organizational hierarchies, right? You build a structure to allocate resources and to direct orders and information. So that's bureaucratization. It's organizational apparatus. Where professionalization really goes through about the assimilation of values, rules of conduct, how you collect information, how you go about to play your professional roles as doctors, as professors, as other kind of professionals. So these are two different processes. And actually, in organizational research findings, these two are substitute to each other. That is to say, whenever you have a large number of professionals, the bureaucratic process becomes weakened. And the other way around, whenever you have a lack of professional processes, then bureaucratic process becomes much longer. In the Chinese context, though, contemporary China, this is actually not the case. You even in those places where you have high-level professionals, for example, in universities, hospitals, all these white-collar professional places, you still have strong bureaucracy. And that's exactly the kind of things people now complain about, right? And so this is a very odd phenomenon to be studied for us. So let me just stop here. I want to hear from Ying and many others. You can the discussion.
I first of all, really, I'm not. Well, just from a historian's perspective, I feel that when historians join this conversation, we really have to understand how social scientists use these terms because they mean different things in different analytical contexts. So I think, Professor Zhou's clarification of a terminology like bureaucratic versus professionalization and their relationships, these I don't think a lot of historians actually consciously follow this type of distinction and definition. So sometimes I think it is actually good that we always pause when we read social scientists' use of these terms in their analysis. Just ask a question: why this? Like, for instance, what Chen Li just talked about, his specific case study and the way he uses these terms. And sometimes I think, we have to make a decision if we want to follow social scientific usage and adopt that in our own research. And I think there are benefits to that as well, because in that way, I feel like we can do more and even go beyond some of the barriers, like sort of, we're not even aware of these problems. For instance, I've always argued that Ming bureaucracy has always been reduced to political history, which is very wrong. And we really need to study bureaucracy on its own terms as bureaucracy instead of just reducing everything to politics. So I think in that sense, this is helpful. But so in terms of theorizing terminology, I can only say this much. But I wanted to quickly comment on this question about over-rationalization. I think it's a very interesting phenomenon. And here I'm seeing a difference between the Ming and the Qing. I think it has something to do with the technology and sort of transportation, all these material conditions of governance. And the other is the intention of the ruling elite. Whether they wanted to collect and how much they want to collect. I think in the main, they sometimes make conscious decision. No, we want to draw a boundary. We don't want this much information. I think this is a very interesting phenomenon. I'm actually study that in my own research. So I think, but I just don't know if we are using over-rationalization in the same way even. So yeah, I guess I will stop there. But earlier, Yang asked a question about the disciplinary difference, and I think I read the social scientific research the same way I read modern historical research, because the term you use are different for me. For instance, Professor Zhou's book, there's a section talking about routine versus campaign. Was it routine versus campaign, right?
Yeah, routine-based, yeah.
Yeah. So for me, routine means something different in Ming bureaucracy. It's not modern routine. So I think that's the other is informal institution and informal procedures. What is informal today might not be informal at the time, and what was informal at the time might be formal today. So I think these disciplinary differences actually could be quite productive. I would just stop here. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
If I can just add to that, so Tony, you talk about the rationalization as a third concept. At least from the Weberian point of view that I read, both bureaucratization and professionalization are part of the rationalization process. Mm-hmm. But the way you put about over rationalization by creating so many different rules in the Chinese bureaucracy, that's over bureaucratization, but not necessarily over rationalization. I think if we make these distinctions, actually we can pinpoint the kind of issues we need to address.
Yeah. Sorry, if I can, because I think because I spoke too fast, so there might be some misunderstanding of some of the things I was trying to make. I did, have read quite, some literature by sociologists, especially of the profession. So I knew the distinction there. I was not really trying to blur the boundaries between, or even the distinction between those concepts. That aside, by over-rationalization, I was not saying actually, the documentation itself is over-rationalization, but I was trying to say the imperial government wanted to ensure the efficiency, the efficacy, or the way the government was working would be predictable, would be controlled effectively by the central government and so on. I think that falls squarely into what Weber would argue as rationalization, but in the Chinese case, I think it's over-rationalized. It's not. Again, the conclusion might be consistent with what you outlined in your own book. That is, there were unintended consequences because it's over-rationalized. So oftentimes the outcomes were not actually predicted by the central government. So it's Weber himself pointed as the kind of, the iron cage, right? The bureaucrats were put into iron cage because they were restrained by all kinds of rules and especially bureaucratic rules and so on. In native China, that was certainly the case. There were too many rules. Eventually, most of the rules were simply disobeyed or just, followed by fines. So I think in that sense, but I mean, this is long conversation. I'm sure there will be no consensus coming out of just a short, talk. But I would very much looking forward to reading the book, and I'm sure there are many more other topics I would love to hear your thoughts on later on. Thanks.
Thank you, Ni. I think it's somehow like a continuation of our discussion like 2 years ago in the state capacity bureaucracy pilot, right? I think it's still like the specter of Weber, right? Because in the Weberian tradition, China is a case of under-rationalization. I think if you think Rui Huang or Kai Su's new book, they think that China is under rationalization in terms of taxation, bureaucracy. But Ni here clearly make an argument that there is some sort of over-rationalization in some of Chinese information control system. So I see some potential tension between the two arguments. And I think there is still probably much work to do, much subtlety than just labeling over-rationalization or under-rationalization. There could be different dimensions in the story. And I maybe other panelists want to give some quick comments before we end our discussion today. We already have 2 hours. If you guys want to say something to respond to these questions, I will let Mary, if you want to say something.
No, I'm good. I've said enough, and I've enjoyed the conversation a lot. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you, Mary. Yingyao, if you want to quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. I just enjoyed very much the conversation. I think the conversation should going forward and, to invite other comparative scholars on the topic of bureaucracy, which it seems like is making a comeback.
Yeah, and we will do more about those things, about empire state bureaucracy in China and beyond. Fei, you want to say something?
Actually, I don't have anything to end. I enjoy the conversation so much.
Thank you. Ying?
No, I learned a great deal from both the book and today's conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ying. So maybe I will give the final to Professor Zhou. You want to maybe as speaker, you have the right to enter the panel in your way.
I just want to take this opportunity to thank you and all of you spend your time to attend this panel. I learned so much from you, and I apologize if I have not picked up the comments you have said or the question you asked. But I hope really this conversation will continue in other form and other platform. And I think this is really beneficial for us to have this cross-disciplinary dialogue. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Zhou. And thank you for all of you for this wonderful discussion of Professor Zhou's book and a lot of insights from our discussants. And I appreciate you taking time to read his book and to join our event. And thank you all, and thank you for more than 300 participants. And we cannot answer all of your questions, but thank you very much for your contribution to this very wonderful discussion. Thank you all, and good night.
Thank you.
In the United States.
Thank you.
Bye bye. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.